Well, as a Forest Hills native, I remember distinctly at a very young age driving down Queens Boulevard for the turn onto the Grand Central Parkway going east and seeing this mammoth statue, the likes of which I had only seen in museums or in books. And in particular, I had been read stories about mythology, Greek and otherwise, and I knew that the statue had some resemblance and significance to these great works of art and these stories of old. And so I didn't at the time know quite what the statue was and what it represented, but even from a very young age, I knew that it was something of unique beauty and grandeur in our little neighborhood of New York City. And I'd always appreciated and taken pride in that. I was shocked. Before I had heard the arguments, it just seemed that we had so little artistically and so little of historical value of that magnitude in this neighborhood, that it just seemed beyond belief that with all of the other problems that the city was facing, that they would be ripping out one of the few pieces of, again, I would say community pride, that no matter how bad things got and how neglected Queens and Kew Gardens might have felt, that we in fact had to look toward as something to be proud of. Well, very shortly thereafter, once I connected the dots between the statue being moved and the statue of my youth, I began to immediately research just what in fact this statue was, what its significance was, and as the facts just became more and more clear about how this statue is meant to represent civic virtue and how these efforts to remove it were so antithetical on their face to the open and honest government that the statue is meant to symbolize, I knew I had to take action, not only for the sake of what I felt was something of value in the community, but to in fact awaken the community to what was being done under its nose. And down to the very last day on the statue's removal, regulars really had no idea. So I had the website up in September, and I heard about the article in late July. Support came not only from neighbors and relatives and friends, but immediately from Community Board 9, which had voted unanimously to have the statue preserved and restored years ago, but unfortunately had been ignored as to their pleas for intervention by both the Landmarks Commission, DCAS, who has jurisdiction over the statue, and any of the funds that might have come from other agencies. I contacted the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, DCAS, and was told by the executive director that no firm plans had been made. Well, firm plans, in fact, had been made. That's not quite true, because in September 28th, which I was not told about, the contract was in fact signed with the cemetery. The one remaining hurdle was for the Public Design Commission to in fact sign off on it, and they held their public hearing on November 13th, announcing it only upon November 9th, which was just a few days after Hurricane Sandy. So many people were without internet access, didn't receive email notifications about it, and quite frankly, the city was in a state of emergency for quite some time. I believe Hurricane Sandy hit not even 4 days prior, and public transit was down, so how could people even come efficiently to respond to a public hearing? And why, of course, were activists like myself not made aware when we had already expressed interest in advocating for the statues remaining on Queens Boulevard? First of all, some people say that it's a man standing on two women. If you go look at the statue's design very carefully, the civic virtue male figure is not standing upon the two women physically. If you examine the two, I don't even know if I call them females, the two humanoid, part creature, part human figures, they are not even being crushed under him in any type of submission. If anything, they're shown in a state of continual temptation of this figure to try and dissuade him from the ideals that he represents. This is not. I think that calling it the Triumph of Civic Virtue may not be entirely accurate. It shows, if anything, that the need to remain vigilant as a citizen and as a government leader, the need to remain vigilant is ongoing. It's not a virtue that one can rest upon their laurels with. I've spoken to a number of immigrants in this community, male and female, and all have unanimously said that this was the sort of thing that they were glad to escape in their home countries. This use of government to censor imagery or freedom of expression which did not please the establishment. And whether or not one feels that civic virtue is sexist or even good art, this does not give government a license to come in and impose its good taste upon the community at public expense. It's a disgrace. This is a blight on a community that is oftentimes at the brink between keeping its historic, charming character and becoming littered with trash, plagued with noise pollution along Queens Boulevard. The statue itself, in fact, was testament to the grime and the soot that develops over this area. The movement of the statue was an all-day affair. I was here by 6:30 a.m. on the Saturday morning when it was done. The work was not completed until probably 8:30 at night. It took all day with a large crane that is not a familiar sight around here, placed on the Grand Central Parkway, arching menacingly over the site itself. They constructed the armature in situ. They initially thought that they knew how to design it so that the statue could be hoisted. However, because of its asymmetry, it had to be reconfigured on the spot. It drew a number of people. A lot of people on a Saturday don't often frequent this area who would come on the weekends. Mostly it will be residents, and so that was whom you had. And people just stopped and stared. They had no clue that the statue was about to be removed after having been here for as long as anyone could remember. Again, for 71 years, the Triumph of Civic Virtue had stood on this site. The worst point was later in the day when it had been slowly hoisted up from its pedestal onto the Grand Central Parkway. Now, I think it was called Able Rigging. They did a wonderful job. However, the residents, when they saw it lowered onto its face, that was just the absolute nadir for most people. One little girl was crying. She had seen this statue every day going to school, and she felt that it was her friend being taken away. And that really echoed my sentiments some 25, 26 years ago when I remembered seeing this statue as a very young boy. People who waited for the bus, who came from neighborhoods all over Queens, they found nothing wrong with this statue, and they were just absolutely flabbergasted that with all of the other problems the city is facing, that it would expend the time, the energy, and the money to move this. It was an exhausting day. It was a cold December day. I was out all day, and filming this, I didn't want to miss the iconic moment when it was in fact lifted up and taken away from its pedestal. Now, I was speaking to people of every stripe, and I felt, in addition to the exhaustion of just standing out here and chronicling the event, however, very justified in that I met so many people from all walks of life whom I didn't manage to meet earlier, stopping and saying, what is going on? This is absolutely wrong. And that, in fact, vindicated for me what I had been saying, which was that the community overwhelmingly, from all walks of life, wanted civic virtue here. They understood that it was not sexist. I had scores, literally scores of women. Every one of them I asked, do you find this sexist? None of them did. And so that felt for me, in the midst of a tragic day, a moment of somewhat personal triumph, that I was not alone. One of the reasons why I became so actively involved, and I don't think I've ever told anyone this before, really was touched upon by an editorial in the Queens Chronicle that said that the community, that Queens didn't really deserve civic virtue. Not because it was sexist, not because it cost too much money to preserve, but because the community didn't rise up and defend something quite precious that it had. And I guess a good measure of my involvement was the fear that maybe on some level they were right, and I wanted to prove that Queens and this particular neighborhood, Kew Gardens, Forest Hills, has people who are active, has people who understand the importance of civic virtue, not only as allegory but as good art.